Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 30th of October, 2022. Hope everybody's doing well out there, had an opportunity to work on your sound projects this week. And hopefully you're excited to talk about field mixers today, like I am. So let's first go over to the agenda and take a look at what we've got going today. First up, talking about why we're covering the Sound Devices 800 series recorders, why going into depth about that. And I guess let me just go ahead and address that now. So I have, I guess I've kind of shied away from covering the more expensive gear because I felt like it wasn't as applicable to as many people in the audience. And but I do get at least once a month, oftentimes 2 or 3 times a month, a request, hey, can you please cover how to work with the Sound Devices 833 or the 888? I don't think I've ever gotten a request to cover the Scorpio, but which is the highest end Sound Devices 8 series recorder. But in any case, I try to do a mix. I try to do a mix of much more affordable gear and in some cases more expensive gear. So that's the reason why I think today I wanted to jump in and talk about this in a little bit more detail. Now, obviously, a lot of people are not going to have access to these recorders, probably don't own them, or may not have an opportunity to work with them. However, if you are in that boat, my hope is that you can get some exposure here to this level of recorder, field mixer, and at some point in the future, if you do have an opportunity to work with them, you'll have a better kind of orientation toward how they work. And even if you don't, I think it will help you understand a little bit better about how production sound works and how to record in general. So that's the thinking behind this. We'll, of course, jump over and talk a little bit about setting up the Sound Devices 8 series, and I'll run through some of the menus, setting up microphones, setting up gain forward wireless mics as well, which is something we covered with the A20 Mini a little while back, and I'll explain what all that means if that doesn't make any sense to you. And then after that, we will head on over to the chat and see what kind of questions we have going there. So with that, let's go ahead and head on over to, let's go to the overhead camera. Let's go ahead and jump right on in. And here we have the Sound Devices 888. Now, what I'm going to cover here today is on the 888, but it generally will apply to the 833 and the Scorpio as well. Now, there are some differences, obviously, between those 3 models. The 833 just having fewer inputs, the 833 not having Dante connectivity, so you can't pick up Dante audio sources on the 833, but you can on the 888 and the Scorpio. So those are the kind of nuanced differences that there are between them. So we're not going to worry too much about those because those differences are relatively minor for what we're covering here today, at least. So, okay, so what I've got in this setup here, this is the Sound Devices 888, and you can see we have 4 big knobs here. These big knobs are the faders for the first 4 channels. Then we have retractable faders for the next 4 channels. So if I push this, it's probably a little bit difficult to see there, but that pops up, and then I can use this as a fader for channels 5, 6, 7, and 8. And those just retract when you're not using them so that you can get them out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this one back down and retract it, or put it back. So that's what those are. Then you have these other knobs here. This is your trim knob right here, and this is also retractable. So for channels 1, 2, 3, and 4, you have these retractable trim knobs, trim being the same as gain in this case. And then you have the same thing for inputs 5, 6, 7, and 8 down here. So I have physical controls, both trim, gain, and a fader for each of the 8 physical inputs on the 888. Okay, now this can actually record up to 16 isolated channels, and we'll talk about that and how you access those others and where you get them. Because if this only has physical inputs for 8, how do you get the additional 8? Well, we'll cover that a little bit later. All right, you also have these switches across the top here, and these switches allow you to get into the menus for each of the inputs. So this first switch here, if I push it to the left, that will take me into the input menu for channel number 1. You can see channel number 1's trim knob starts kind of flashing there. If I want to go to input number 5, I push this channel to the right. And you can see it's not flashing because I don't have it on right now. Now it starts flashing. So there's channel number 5. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Go back to channel number 1. So that's how you access the channel menus. You have these physical switches to get in there. And then we'll pop back out. We then have right here the recording, or kind of the transport joystick. So I don't know if you can see this, but if I push up on this, it starts a recording. If I press straight down on it like a button, it stops the recording. If I press down on the joystick, it starts playing back the track that you have selected. And if I press down again, it stops that track. And of course, I can cue forward and backwards while I'm playing as well, or this will cue between the different takes that I have on the card here. You can see here in the top left corner here, the T, that's referring to the file. That's take number, in this case, 48, it looks like. So I can kind of just move through those by using the forward and back. Okay. We then have two encoders here. This is usually going to be, by default, the headphone volume knob here, and this will be the menu encoder or knob here. Now, if I want, I also have some buttons here. If I want to get into the menus, I press this menu button right here. That takes me into the main menu. Obviously, the on and off switch right there. I then also have a button over here. This can do a variety of things. This takes me by default into my meter view. So if I want to change the metering view, I can just choose a different metering preset here. So here, for example, there we go. Let's come back to the standard view there. So on the standard view, you have a horizontal left and right mix meter, and then you have vertical meters for inputs 1 through 8. But again, you can change that, and you can go into the menus and kind of customize that to what works best for you. In addition, we have a couple of switches, actually 3 switches along the bottom of the screen here that fill different purposes. I would think of them as kind of soft switches. They can change depending on what you're doing, but I can actually turn on the slate mic. So now you can see as I'm talking, there's an inbuilt microphone here. So the slate mic is picking up what I'm saying. And if I press it again, it turns off the slate mic. The idea with that is that if you are getting ready to make a take, to do a take, you can actually turn the slate mic on so that you can hear the mixer describe what the scene is or leave a note or of some sort. Or if I'm at the end of a take and I know that this is a bad take, we're not going to use it, I can quickly turn that slate mic on and say, bad take, ignore this one, or whatever kind of note I need to leave for the post team or for myself if I'm doing the post. That's what that switch moving to the left does. The switch moving to the right by default turns on tone. So what that does is it sends a 1 kilohertz tone to all of the channels, and that's often used to make sure that your outputs are receiving the right levels. So if I'm going to send audio from this recorder into a camera, for example, I would turn on tone, and notice it's at -20 dB. Then I would go over to my camera and adjust the input level until the meters on the camera were also at -20 dB. That way they're calibrated between the two of them. So that's how you use the tone right there. All right, we have this star and double star key. Those are actually programmable. I can set those up to do whatever I want. So if there's something that I find myself doing over and over and over again, I can actually program those to do those functions, whatever those might be. Okay, this switch here, if I push it to the left, it allows me to monitor the return. It's probably a little bit more complex than we're really going to talk about here today, but if I want to get audio if I'm returning audio from a camera, say I'm sending audio from this to the camera, and then from the camera back to this, and I want to hear that audio coming back from the camera, I would just push this to the left, and then I can hear the return. And all that's doing is really making sure that the audio at the camera isn't clipping, and that you're getting a good signal in the camera as well. So that's what that's for. And then I have this fave right here. This will allows me to kind of toggle through my headphone presets in this case. You can see I can listen to the left and right, or I can go to preset 1. In my case, preset 1 is actually listening to just the isolated channels. So not the mix, just a combination of the isolated channels. So we'll another time we can talk about headphone routing and all of that entails. But that's just sort of a general view of things here. In this particular case, I also have what's called the SL2, the super slot attachment here. And what this allows me to do is to attach two wireless receivers and send that audio directly from the receivers into the 888 without any additional wires or cables inside my bag here, so it makes it a little tidier. But it also adds some other features as well. So it can power these receivers, and each of the slots on the receiver can accommodate anything that's super slot capable, any receiver that's super slot capable, and it can receive up to 4 channels of audio per slot. So this SL2 unit in total can receive 8 channels of wireless audio. It also has some digital AES inputs, so I can bring in additional digital AES audio. So if I have some additional receivers that can send out digital AES audio, I could also connect those into this and get those directly into the 888 in this case, without using any of the additional inputs on the side of the 888. So that's a pretty nice thing there. It also has connections for diversity antennas. So you've got a connection 1 here and connection 2 here. And what that does is with my diversity antenna, so I have a shark fin antenna with a dipole secondary antenna. And so that connects here and here, those two inputs, the shark fin and the dipole. And then those connect to the receivers, which are diversity receivers. And so the receivers can then switch back and forth between those antennas depending on which one has the better signal at the moment. So that's the idea with the SL2. Just keeps things nice and tidy, compact, and makes things really easy to work with. The big advantage too is that I can control a lot of this right here from the menus. So I can control my my receivers right here from the menu on the 888. I don't necessarily have to use the menus on the receivers, which are, as you can see, a little bit smaller. Well, actually you can't see because we haven't turned them on yet, but we'll go into that in just a little bit. Okay, let me go ahead and start walking through the menus here so you can see how these are set up here. All right, first up we have a power menu. So with something like an 888, if you're using a field mixer at this level, and this is nearly a $10,000 mixer, this is the type of thing that you would typically see on a production film set or a production TV set. The important thing is that you need to have redundant power sources. And in this case here, let me just pull this down without hopefully jostling my microphone too much. And over here, I have a power distribution system. In this case, it's the PSC triple play. So it can take 3 different power inputs. And currently we have 2 smart batteries attached to it, 1 and 2. But then on my sound card, I also have a third very large battery, a 1 kilowatt hour battery, sitting down on the bottom of the sound card, and it does a couple of things, obviously. That goes into the third input here, so I can power with 3 different batteries. So if one of these run out or the big battery on the bottom runs out, it switches over immediately to one of these instead. So that makes it easier. So I'm not going to miss a take because my batteries ran out, and I also have a bridge battery system. In addition to that, on all 3 of them, the 833, 888, and the Scorpio, there are also Sony L-series battery sleds on the bottom of the units. I don't currently have any batteries attached there, though these are kind of the pretty common NPF style batteries. I don't currently have those attached. That's why those are not showing anything at the moment. But
You need to move it up.
Oh, I need to move it back up because I am showing the other part here. So let's move that back up and into the frame about right there. Sorry. So here's the power menu. Apologies for that. So this is showing that right now DC power is coming in, and that's being fed from the triple play that we showed you just a moment ago. There's also an indicator here for the timecode battery. So there's an inbuilt battery for the timecode generator inside the 888. And what happens, the way that works is once you power on the unit, which is powered from either one of those NPF style batteries or your external battery distribution system, it charges up this timecode battery so that when you, for example, pause filming for a meal, for dinner, for lunch, whatever, you can actually power this unit down, and that internal timecode battery will keep the timecode generator powered through the meal easily for an hour or two. And then that way you don't have to jam again after the meal. So that's one thing there. These units also have inbuilt chargers, so you can actually charge the NPF style batteries from the other external power sources. And also, by the way, you can plug in to this triple play power distribution system. If I've got AC power, I also have an AC adapter I can plug in to power the entire unit as well. So if I do have AC power available, then I don't even have to use batteries. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of that menu. We're going to come back to the channel setups. That's going to be the inputs for each microphone or line input channel. Next up, we have the buses, and that's probably a little bit more complex. So since we're covering the basics today, we'll probably come back to another session and talk about that. But let me go into the outputs menu and just give you a little overview on that. So the 888 in particular has left and right main outputs, but it also has X1 through X8, or 6, excuse me, 6? Is it 6 or 8? It's 8. So it has 8 different outputs, auxiliary outputs, plus the main left and right outputs. And what I can do is just define what gets sent to each of those outputs. Now you might say, well, that's a lot of outputs, and why would you ever need all of those outputs? And if you're on a production set, that's where something like this becomes important, where something like a MixPre or a Zoom F-Series might not have enough outputs. So if I need to send a mix to the director, and I need to send a mix to the script supervisor, and I may need to send communication channels, comms channels to other members of the sound department, I might need different outputs because I want them to hear different things. And what this output routing allows you to do is define exactly what is sent to each of those individual outputs. And so you can send a different mix to the script supervisor, a different mix to the director, a different mix to any producers, a different mix to the rest of your sound crew, so on and so forth. So it gives you a ton of flexibility on what exactly all those people will hear. And this is just a pretty typical routing screen here where I can define exactly what's being sent. So on a lot of the productions I work on, for example, I might just send the boom microphone and not the wireless or the wires, as they're confusingly often the wireless microphones are called wires. But I may not want to send them all of that because those might be, the boom mic might be out of phase from the lavaliers, and I may just want them to hear the boom mic so that they don't get confused about what they're hearing, and they feel confident that we're capturing great sound for the production. For my boom operator, again, I might want to send both the boom mic, or maybe I want to send the boom mic into the left ear of their headphones, and I might want to send all of the lavalier microphones, maybe at a lower level, into their right ear. I can configure that here as well. So that's the idea at a high level with the outputs in the menu here. Now we have some other outputs as well. We have Dante. So what is Dante? Dante is digital audio over an Ethernet network. So there's an Ethernet port on the back of the 888, and I can connect to a local area network. And any other Dante audio on that network can receive audio from my 888. So I can tell it exactly what to send to the Dante outputs. And you can see here we have 16 different Dante outputs. Now remember, earlier, I said, hey, we have these controls for 8 physical inputs. What about the other channels? Well, here's where you can control those. Here's part of where you can control those other channels. So these are the outputs that you have. But we also have corresponding Dante inputs, and we'll come to that in just a little bit. We also have USB outputs. So if I'm connected to a computer, I've got a USB port here. If I connect that to a computer, I can define what gets sent to each of the USB outputs. And then I also have the headphones, and I can define exactly how those are set up here and what I hear in my headphones. Now that can be confusing. You might think, well, why don't I just want to hear everything in my headphones? Well, sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't when you're on a production set. A lot of times I just want to hear the ISOs. I'm not necessarily focused on recording. If I'm doing like a smaller job and I'm operating from the bag, I'm not going to be doing a really sophisticated mix. And so for me, it's more important to make sure that my isolated channels are sounding good and I'm capturing what I need to on the isolated channels. So I might set up my headphone preset to listen to that. So obviously you can listen to the left and right stereo mix. You can listen to the left and right summed down to mono if you prefer. Again, if you're not doing any panning, there would be, in essence, very little difference between those. I can listen to just the left mono. I can listen just to the right mono. All of those, but I can also set up my own presets here and define how that works. Okay, so here, oh, and we would edit by doing the soft key there. So you can see right now my headphone preset 1 is the pre-fader inputs from inputs 1 through 4. So I'm just listening to microphone inputs 1 through 4 before the fader makes any change to them. And that's exactly what I'm hearing in my headphones if I use preset 1. Now the difference is between that, if I come back out here, if I'm listening to the left and right stereo headphone preset, what I'm hearing instead, and I can come in, I don't know if you can edit this one. No, that's just a standard one there. But what would happen there is if I did have any fader changes, anything other than 0 dB to any of these, that's what I would hear instead. I would hear the fader, the effects of the faders in my headphones as well. Whereas if I went down to preset number 1 down here, I would not hear the effects of these fader changes that I've made. Okay, because it would be sending the audio to my headphones before the fader. Hopefully that makes sense there. And when you might want to do that, again, in my case, because I'm not often working on a really sophisticated mix, the mix is, or in some cases not even recording a mix, I'm just recording the isolated inputs. A lot of times I'll use that headphone preset. So that's the idea there. And that's outputs at a very high level. Next up, we have our limiters here. So the nice thing about the Sound Devices 8 series is they all have these high quality optical, well, I don't know if they're optical, they're analog in any case, limiters built in for each of the inputs. And they sound great, but you can also adjust some of their settings here. So for example, I can quickly turn all of them on or off by accessing that here. Whoops, let's go back into that menu. And the same thing with the bus limiter. So I also have buses, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit here. Well, probably not in this session, but we'll come back to that in another session. But you can route everything. That's the beauty of the Sound Devices 8 series, is it's fully routable. That is to say, physical input number 1 doesn't have to be controlled by channel number 1 controls. It can actually be controlled by any of these that you assign. So if you want to instead, for whatever reason, put it on channel 4, you can connect to an XLR cable to input number 1 and control it with the controls for channel 4. And it becomes channel 4 at that point. So it's fully routable, which some of the earlier generation Sound Devices mixers were not, and a lot of others are not. So that's one thing. So where does that become useful? For me, I think what I like to do is almost always have the boom mic on input number 1. I think typically most post teams are going to expect the boom microphone on input number 1. So if you, for whatever reason, have to connect the boom microphone to a different physical input, you can still assign it to input number 1 as one example. There are probably other things that you may encounter at some point, but that's one example there. But in any case, I can fine-tune the settings of the limiters here. So all of the channel limiters will have the same settings here based on what I configure here. And I just leave these at the default, typically -6 dB for the threshold and a 20:1 ratio. So basically it's a compressor with a really pretty intense ratio. So for every 20 dB of audio that exceeds the threshold, it'll be actually squashed down to 1 dB above the threshold. So, and it acts pretty quickly here. So the attack time is 1 millisecond and the release time is 100 milliseconds. So we won't talk about all of the details and what that means, but you do have flexibility to change that both for the channel limiters and for the bus limiters right there in the menu. We also have auto mix that comes on the 8 series, at least it used to, I think it still does. And it comes with 2 different flavors. It comes with a Dugan auto mixing, and it also comes with Sound Devices' own flavor, which they call MixAssist. And that's the same MixAssist that you find on the Sound Devices MixPre series. And they're just different algorithms. They can be better suited for the particular use, the particular setup that you're using. So for example, if I'm doing a roundtable discussion, what I generally find is that MixAssist will give me a cleaner mix. It'll reduce more potential ambient noise from open microphones that aren't currently being used. However, I find that the Dugan Auto Mix generally sounds more transparent. It's less obvious that there's some mixing going on. So that's kind of, from my point of view, that's kind of the trade-off between the two. But this is where you would enable this if you wanted to use MixAssist or Dugan Auto Mixing, and you would just enable that right here. And then what you do is you can tell it whether or not the LED rings around the channel will turn on and show what the active microphone is. That's what that does. And then you can choose which microphones will be included in the auto mix. And let's say I have a 4-person discussion. I might say inputs 1 through 4 should be auto mixed. And that's how you set that up. Okay, we also have noise suppression, and there are 2 different flavors of that on the Sound Devices 8 series. There is NoiseAssist, and there is also Cedar DNX. So I only have NoiseAssist installed here. You can see I can use a trial of Cedar DNX. At some point I'll go back and do that, but here's NoiseAssist turned on, and I can tell it where to apply that. Now I have, on this particular license, I can do 2 different channels of noise suppression. So I can apply that to maybe channel 1 and channel 2, but you can see if I try to select other channels, it won't let me. Or I could say, you know what, I really just want to put this on the left mix. So let's just put it on the left mix. And that way, is everything good?
There's a fan somewhere.
There's a fan somewhere that just kicked on. We're not sure where.
Is that about it?
I don't know. Anyway, excuse the fan. Apologies for that. But that's one thing I can do here. So the nice thing about this is if I want a safety, that is to say I want to apply noise suppression, but I don't want it to be, I don't want it to destroy my isolated channels or kind of mess up my isolated channels if anything goes wrong. I can apply it to a mix channel or to a bus channel even, and I can record that bus separately. So in post, that means that the post team would have a pre-noise reduced mix of everything, and they would also have the isolated channels, and they would have a clean mix as well. So that would look like this if I were going to do that. So I would get a clean mix, clean isolated channels, but I would have a noise reduced bus recording. So that's what that would do. So again, you can see this is I think kind of highlighting what features a high-end recorder mixer like this has that things like the MixPre series or the Zoom F series don't have. So it's all this additional flexibility for meeting the demands on a production set. Kinds of things that people that are doing smaller jobs generally don't need. When I'm making YouTube videos, frankly, I don't need all this. I don't need these features generally. Or I can just use a MixPre that does have NoiseAssist and just apply it to one channel, or just apply it to the mix or whatever. So you just get a lot more flexibility on things like this. So that's the idea with the noise suppression. I'm going to go ahead and disable that for now. Okay. Next up, we have meters, and you can tell, we talked about the meter presets previously. This is where you would set those up. So you can have different views depending on what works best for you in the particular production you're working on, how many microphone inputs you're using, or other audio sources. All right, next we have timecode and sync. And we have a variety of different timecode modes that are supported here. I don't want to get too in the weeds on this, but if you are using timecode, this is where you would set that up. So in this case, I have free run currently selected, and this is where you set your frame rate. And then if you're going to jam to an external timecode generator, you would do it in this menu here. You would connect your timecode generator to the timecode input on the side here. It would read it, and then you would be able to jam the two of them together. And in this menu, you can make sure that they're actually entirely synced up and ready to go. So here's another example of like the extreme flexibility of something like this. Different timecode generators do their LEMO connectors. They're pin designations differently, so they wire them differently. So you can actually change which type you're using here. That's the kind of flexibility that you get with something like this that you typically wouldn't have with other recorders. All right, that's an overview, very, very high overview of time code. Next up, we have the recording and play menu. This is where you set your sample rates. And of course, this can support anywhere from 44.1 up to 192 kilohertz sample rates. And your bit depth here, it supports 16 or 24. I do get people asking, well, gosh, you're paying nearly $10,000 for a mixer, and it doesn't even do 32-bit float? And the answer is no, it does not. And typically in production sound, I don't think that's really necessary. Most production sound mixers don't have a pressing need for that. If they are going to go record some sound effects where they do want to have 32-bit float, then they will typically have a backup recorder, or they'll have their small bag recorder or their second unit bag recorder, which might be a MixPre, which can do that. So I'm not making excuses, but typically for production sound, we just don't need 32-bit float. Just really not necessary. You have a dedicated person operating sound on the mixer. They can handle the gain structure, and they're able to get everything done that needs to get done. You can also set up your pre-roll time and post-roll time, so you get up to 10 seconds of pre-roll time and 10 seconds of post-roll time. What does that mean? That means when I start recording, when I push up on the joystick, it'll actually take the 10 seconds prior and also record that. So what that means in practical terms is whatever microphones you have attached to this and armed, it is constantly listening to them and buffering that audio for 10 seconds. So be careful what you say. But it also does that. There's a post-roll time as well. So when you press stop, it'll actually keep rolling for that period of time. And again, that's up to 10 seconds as well. Now, there's this kind of unassuming menu here called track to media routing. This is actually kind of a big deal and important. And by default, all tracks will get recorded to all three media. Now, this has an inbuilt SSD drive, but it also has two SD cards. So every time you're recording, you can define what gets recorded to each of those, to the SSD drive and each of the SD cards. And you can record just the isolated microphone or line level inputs, just the mix, just the buses, or you can record all of them. And the default is to record all of them. But if you need to customize that for whatever reason, you can do that right in here. All right. Popping back out. Next up is the Files menu. Whoops, I accidentally hopped out before we went to the Files menu. Here we go, Files. Excuse me. All right, first up we have the take list. And in here, you can actually define what your take is going to be called. So if I come in here, I can actually, this is where I can enter a lot of metadata about the take. So I can put notes on each track. I can leave some sticky notes that get applied to all of them. I can change the scene name. I can change or reset the take number. I've got the folder and project names. And then I can actually name the input channels. So for input number 1, for example, if I want to change that from channel 1, I can name it something else by coming in here. And let's say I want to call this the boom. I'm just going to come in here, boom, and then save. Now channel number 1 is called the boom mic. And in fact, if I come back out to the main screen, you can see now that this is named boom. So that's just a way to really identify everything and keep everything clear and straight, because there's so much flexibility. You have to be organized when you're working with a mixer like this. And that's one way to do that, is to get yourself a little bit more organization and name all of the tracks. So that's the Files menu. In the Files menu, we can also, of course, format all of our drives. So I can format the internal SSD drive, the SD cards. So if I come in here to let's format SD card 1. It asks me if I'm sure. I say, okay, I can actually give that drive a name. So, you know, when you format on your computer a drive, it lets you name that drive. This does the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and say save. So it's going to call that the 888 SD1. And now that's all formatted and ready to go. We can also transfer files off of the SSD drive from this using a USB cable. And we have some other options in there that we're not going to jump into right now. That's another thing about the 888 and the 8 series in general is that you do have some comms integration. So what are comms? When you're on location or on set, and you have a multi-person sound crew, or you have multiple members of the crew that need audio, or you need to be able to communicate with in a two-way fashion, back and forth. So for example, if I'm mixing and I have a boom operator and I need to tell my boom operator, hey, can you please go check the lav on actor XYZ? Looks like we're getting some cutouts there, or we're getting some clothing rustle there. That's what the comms allow you to do. And in this menu, you can set those up and choose the routing and how it all works and which microphone input you're going to use to talk to your crew and so on and so forth. And you can make sure that that communication only happens on the wireless feeds that you're sending to your crew, your sound crew, and not to the director and not to the script supervisor. Or you might set up a separate comm to the director if you need to get in touch with the director and you've agreed ahead of time that that's how you want to do that, then you can set that up to do that as well. All right, next up we have Super Slot. And on Super Slot here, I can actually, first of all, you'll notice that these are turned off right now. First of all, I need to feed them power, and so I do that in here. So we're going to turn just this one on for our demo. And it's figuring out what kind of receiver is connected there right now, because obviously it has to be able to communicate with different types of receivers. So we'll pop back out. Oh, now it says, okay, this one's alive. This one's here. Now I'm going to use just one channel of audio there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pop into this menu and I'm going to tell it just use power from channel number 1. It's a dual channel receiver. So I can pop back out. Whoops. And now it's hard to see, but now we just have the left receiver turned on for this unit right here. And we're just going to use one of them in a minute here. But in this menu, I can do other things here. So I can go and do an RF scan here. So we can start the scan. And it's checking to see what frequencies are being used right now. And right now, things are looking really nice and clean in our little bunker here. Isn't that good news? So we don't have anything going on right now. Actually, the reality is that's because I don't have the antennas attached. I have detached the antennas. That's the feed right here. But that's why we're getting basically nothing. Life is never, this is not real life. It never looks like that. What you'll typically see is you'll see spikes where there's some sort of radio frequency at a particular frequency in that whole band there. So that's one thing you can do here. All right, and then you can also get some additional information about each of your receivers here. You can go in and change the frequency for your receiver. You've got some other options here. So again, you can update the firmware for your receiver even while it's attached here, as opposed to having to pull all of this out and do that manually. But that's another course as well, RF. So there's that. Then we have our system menu. System menu is where you do things like set your tone setup, which channels you want to set tone to, how loud it is, what frequency it is. Then we've got a bunch of things, setting your date and time, doing firmware updates, figuring out what version you have currently, turning on the Bluetooth radio or turning it off. You have this expansion port to which the SL2 slot system is attached, so that's where you turn that on or off. But that's the system menu there. And then you can also use external controllers. So Sound Devices makes the CL16, which is it looks a lot like a traditional mixing board, but that connects directly to your 888 or your Scorpio. And I believe it's supposed to be in a firmware update. If it hasn't already, it's also available to work with the 833. But that gives you a big, nice control surface if you are working from a larger cart. That gives you just a much bigger controls, a much bigger screen to work with. It just makes it more ergonomic if you're going to be working hours and hours and hours at a cart. So this is where you would set all of that up. And then you also have quick setup here. So I can save all of my global settings. So if I go in and get everything set up the way I want it, I can go ahead and save that and then recall it later. So if something gets muddled up, I can come in here and get that. changed again. Okay, let's go ahead and show you how you would set up an individual microphone. So I'm going to come into channel number 1 here. I've just hit that switch there. And if I hadn't already, I would need to turn the trim on. And you can see it's showing how much gain we're applying here. Now what I need to do is I need to choose what is which microphone input or line input I'm going to use for these controls here for channel 1. So I'm going to go here to that input menu, and I'm going to say, okay, I'm using input number 1. So I have a physical XLR cable plugged in on the left-hand side here in the sound bag to input number 1, and it's a boom microphone, so I need to send phantom power. Okay. Now you can see I'm starting to get levels, so that's great. So I can go ahead and adjust my trim here, and I'll probably optimize my levels so that I'm peaking somewhere around -12. Now, if you're doing a scripted piece, -12 is a pretty good place to be. I mean, these are clean preamps. You don't have to go that high, but if it's a scripted piece and you know there's not going to be any screaming or yelling or loud laughing or anything like that, that's a pretty safe place to be. But if I was doing something unscripted, I would probably gain down a little bit more. And a question I get a lot is, what is a little bar that sticks for a while versus the green? So the green is essentially a VU meter. That's in essence an average level. And then the little bar is the peak level. So the highest amplitude you're getting is that little bar. And that's what I'm generally using to adjust the levels to know where I'm at. I never want that to be up against 0 or hitting up against the limiter. So if I gain up too much, you can see I'm constantly up against the limiters here. Never want to do that. So I'm going to gain back down here, and that's going to take me so that I'm peaking somewhere around -12 like that. Okay. Now in this menu, we have a bunch of other options as well. We have the ability to link. So if I'm doing a stereo recording, I can link input number 1 and input number 2 in a couple of different ways. I can link them as just stereo pair and then control them from the same trim knob, or I can set them up as a mid-side pair. So it's a different type of stereo recording. Again, really outside the scope of what we're talking about today, but that's where I would set up a stereo pair right there. Next up, I have the high pass filter, or low cut if you prefer. Same thing, different names. And here's where I set the frequency. So typically for spoken word, I almost always leave that on at about 50 hertz. I don't go higher than that, typically maybe 65, unless I'm doing live sound. And then I just kind of tune it by ear. But that's the low cut filter. We have a phase invert here. So if I have the boom microphone and you're getting this, and you have lav microphones coming in at the same time and they're sounding really kind of hollow and weird, sometimes inverting the phase of one of them will help them get closer so that you're not getting that kind of really heavy comb filtering. So that's one thing you can do there. There's also a delay. So if I have a digital wireless microphone system that I'm bringing in on the other channels, and I have a wired boom mic on this channel, I might want to apply a little bit of a delay here so that they will be in sync. Digital wireless microphone systems typically have some latency. It takes them some amount of time before they arrive at the mixer. So in any case, that's what that's for. I'm going to just rush through the rest of these settings, and then we're going to go to the questions. I know we're running a little long here. So, all right, here's where you turn the limiters on and off. You also have a compressor that you can turn on. So that's a nice feature as well. You can turn that on there. Here is where, let's see here. I'm having a hard time seeing. Just a second. Oh, this is if you're going to record the isolated channel pre or post fader, you can change that here. I've also got an equalizer, so I can apply some EQ there if I need to. Here's where I turn on the auto mix or turn it off. And then if I had NoiseAssist on or Cedar DNX, that would be available there. And then finally, we have our routing. So this is where we send this audio. And by default, it's going to go to the left and right mix, which you can see there, post fader. That means the fader will affect what gets sent to the left and right mix. That's the default. That's how you generally want it. And then it also sends it to all of the buses, but it sends it at -infinity. So in essence, it's not sending the audio to the other buses. It's sending it there, but you're not getting any signal. So if I wanted to actually send some of that to bus number 1, for example, I would bump this back up to 0 dB here if that's what I wanted to do. So just at a very high level, That's how you get the audio to the buses. You need to arm your channels. If you want them to be recorded, you have to arm them. So this is where you do that. And you can make sure this is how you arm or disarm. And I can actually pop back out to the main screen. If I want to arm input number 1, I can hold down this button and press this encoder at the same time to arm it. So you can see now it's red. That means that channel number 1 is now armed. Or I can disarm it here as well. Okay, we probably better pause there. Let's go back out to the chat and see what questions we have.
We're going to start at the very
We're starting at the very beginning. I'm going to take a sip of water while we're... Okay, first we have a question that has nothing to do with the Sound Devices 8 series, but it's a fine question. For your main channel videos, do you schedule them to post at a specific time or just upload them and go live when finished uploading? I usually schedule them, Christopher, and there are a couple reasons for that. I think there's a follow-up question. If you schedule them as always for the same time, we try to do it every Sunday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. We've been pretty consistent the last several months, but there have been times when I'm just running behind and we haven't been able to hit that target. But the reason I schedule them, as opposed to just upload them and let them go live as soon as they're done uploading, is that a lot of times it takes YouTube longer to process the video. So if you send them live as soon as you're done uploading, people will get a lower quality version of them at first. So it'll play back, even if they're on a computer and they have the capability of playing back at UHD, it may still be played back at 360p or whatever I don't remember, 400, whatever the lower resolutions are. So usually I schedule it. And another reason for the scheduling is that it allows consistency for the audience to know generally when to expect the new videos, so they can be looking for them as well. So those are my thoughts behind that. Okay, next question.
Also unrelated.
Chris, also unrelated. I have 2 questions. Do you have any updated opinions or thoughts on the WLav Pro and the DA35 connectors regarding durability?
There's a second round.
I haven't really used them a lot, Chris, I'll be honest. They're fine, but I have used them very, very little. Just because I have so many options, not because they're bad. They're fine. Just haven't used them a lot. What are your thoughts on Sony's UWP system compared to Sennheiser's G4 500 system? I have not used... I've used the G3 system, just the 100 series, fairly extensively in the past, but I haven't used the Sony UWP system. The Sony seems like a really solid system. The only thing that's kind of unusual about it is that the wiring for the LaV inputs is different than every other out there. So it's you have to have your microphones terminated specifically for Sony wireless. Although that's not unusual with others too. I mean, audio limited Sound Devices is its own wiring scheme as well. So you just have to be prepared to pay for the, a custom termination. And I apologize. I have not used the G4 and not the 500 series, so I don't know. But my sense is they're both pretty solid. I mean, Sennheiser, sure. Even Sony's probably bigger as far as sound, audio, or wireless systems is probably bigger in the news gathering and TV worlds than it is in the film and TV production worlds. But my sense is that they're pretty good too. I mean, Sony doesn't make a lot of garbage. They make some pretty good stuff. So I don't have a specific comparison between those two though.
There's a lot of conversation.
Yeah, we can skip the conversation, just go to the questions. If you do have a question, if you would tag it with @CurtisJuddAudio, that would make it a lot easier for us to find. So if you do have a question you really would like us to address, definitely put the @CurtisJuddAudio.
There's a clarification on this one.
Do you apply filters at the front end of the sound chair? Chain, okay. Would you prefer to high pass the sound at the mic, bass roll off the recorder before going to edit? Usually if I do any sort of high pass or low cut in the recording itself, as I mentioned just a moment ago, I'll almost do a really very mild one that will not be anything that gets in the way of the post team if I am handing off to a post team. So typically that'll be like a 50 hertz, maybe a 60 hertz. If it's a woman's voice, maybe a little bit higher, but I don't do anything extreme with those. I keep it really, really mild. So I do it and the reason I do it is if I am getting a lot of rumble, just for monitoring purposes, I need to clean a little bit of that up. I know there are others that have different opinions. This is purely opinion. I believe I heard Alan Williams, who's a professional boom operator, say that he never applies a high-pass filter. He gives post everything. So those just two different opinions. I want you to know that that's an opinion, but I generally will apply just a very mild high-pass filter.
Okay, this is also has two parts.
Okay. The fan is probably the light, by the way, is if we just figured out. Fachiri, quick question for anyone who may have an answer. Is there a way to play or go through all of the audio on the sound devices card on the MixPres?
SD card.
SD card on the MixPres.
And then here's the rest of it.
We were using the same SD card for a couple of days, and the client wanted to hear takes from the previous day, but I couldn't navigate to them. Just wondering if it's possible. Yeah, I think you have to choose if you had different. If you had them set up as different projects, you have to go back to the previous project. So you have to go back into the. I don't have a MixPre here, but there's in the top left screen on the main screen, or top left corner on the main screen, you can tap on that, and that'll get you your project menu, and you have to select the project for the previous day if that's how you set it up. I don't know, obviously, but that's the first thing I'd check. Yanti, very good walkthrough of the 888. How can you mount a slot receiver in a bag in a good way? Your rack mount looks very nice, but overkill for one slot unit. Most bags have little, if we go back to the overhead here, Danny. Most bags will have a way for you to mount them without a slot receiver in the bag itself. So these batteries, for example, they have little elastic bands that hold them in place. And previously, before I had the SL2 system, I would attach my receivers in those little elastics here. So in this case, you're using an Orca bag. Most of the bags that I've seen have some way to attach a wireless receiver inside the bag like that in a secure way. So that's how I would generally approach it.
Okay.
Alex, after you do the RF scan, how do you assign the clean frequencies to your transmitters? Well, let's go back and I can show you. Well, there are a couple things. Now, if you're doing more than 2 channels, there's something called intermodulation that starts occurring. It actually occurs even with 2 channels, but it's generally not an issue. Intermodulation, when you have 2 transmitters in an area close to each other, which you typically will for using wireless microphones, what happens is that the 2 of them essentially combine and create another spike in the frequencies at a different frequency. So that will define where you want to put your 3rd channel of wireless audio. So there is an app. I know it's on iOS. I think it's also available for Android. It's called Freq Finder, F-R-E-Q Finder. And what that will do is it will actually help you identify. So if you say, I want to put my wireless microphones on this frequency, and this frequency, it will tell you where the intermodulation will occur so that you can avoid those frequencies where the intermodulation will occur. We actually did we had a sound for video session with Michael Wynn, I think back in 2020 or 2021. I think it was in 2020 where he came onto the session and talked about that. So if you do a search for Curtis Judd, Michael Wynn, W-Y-N-N-E, you can jump into that and you'll see exactly how we go about setting those frequencies. So it's a great question. Christopher, you are indirectly addressing it, but one of the big differentiators of Pro recorders like the 8 series is that all channels are routable and not one-to-one between input and channel. Yeah, and so on my previous 633, which is the previous generation, the smaller field mixer from Sound Devices, input 1 was always channel 1. There was no way to change it. On the 8 series, fully routable. There you can choose exactly what is on channel 1. You can choose exactly what goes to all of the outputs. It is wildly flexible. So that's one thing that you don't get on the prosumer level recorders. So yes, Christopher, absolutely. Mark, all those features I'm now missing and wanting on my MixPre. Well, it's a pardon the pun, it's a mixed bag. that also makes it much more complicated to operate, and that's especially challenging for solo operators. That's where a MixPre is a much better option in most cases. So yes, there are a lot of features, and yes, it has everything you could ever possibly need, but it also makes it a lot more complex, and it makes it, frankly, more difficult to troubleshoot when you are having a problem. So don't miss your MixPre too much. And in fact, Michael Wynn is one example. He uses his main recorder, used to be a 688. I think he still has his 688, but the main production mixer he uses now is an Aton Digital Kantar X3. So a big mixer along these lines. But then he also has his second bag, which has a Sound Devices MixPre in it. So depending on what he's using, he may pull out that small bag for really simple scenes. Whereas if he's doing the bigger scenes with lots of wires, which again means wireless microphones, plus a boom mic, or maybe 2 boom mics, or maybe 3 boom mics. He's got that flexibility. So don't miss your MixPre. Even if you ever got a mixer like this, a MixPre is still a wonderfully useful tool to have at the same time. Fachiri, quick question: would you use NoiseAssist on the bus of the tracks, or does it depend on the content? Well, first of all, I think there's a big discussion about when NoiseAssist is useful and when it's not. So again, if there's going to be post-production, I would typically not use NoiseAssist. I would let the post team do that because they're going to do it in a way so that it's not non-destructive. The thing is with NoiseAssist, it's great, and the same with Cedar DNX, great, but not perfect. And so if the boom mic, for example, gets far enough away and you pick up the signal to noise ratio between the person you're trying to capture and the noise around them gets low enough, then NoiseAssist starts getting confused and it does some weird kind of cutting in and out. So if you're going to do it, I would just send it to a bus on an 8 series recorder. If you're going to do it on a MixPre, I would just send it to the mix if you're not using the mix for something else. So that way you're safe. You still have the unaltered audio tracks recorded independently, and then you have the NoiseAssist applied to just one of the bus. So I would typically send it to a bus, or apply it at a bus, I should say. All right, Chris, thanks for answering. I rarely see the Sony system discussed or reviewed. Greetings from, I'm not sure which flag that is, but Chris, maybe it's Jamaica.
Yeah.
We don't know. we plead ignorance, and we apologize in advance. Thanks, Chris. Bankbuster Productions. When you apply the high pass filter, does it appear in the EQ window? Let's take a look. We're going to go back into our channel menu. So Danny will cut to the overhead here. And we currently have 50 hertz. And I think the high pass is actually independent of the EQ. Oh, actually it does show. Yeah, it does show. So it goes ahead and shows it in the EQ window as well, to answer your question. So there you go. You get 3 more parameters, it looks like, or 3 more control points. All right, cool. While Danny's looking up for the other questions, let me just show you as well. I have, oh, Danny's got it. Never mind. We're going to come back.
I'm trying to do too much at once.
And we're running up on time here. Teacher of teachers, I'm revealing again my newbie status, but in these days of smartphones, Wi-Fi everywhere, does any wireless system guarantee lack of interference for a system like Sound Devices 8 series? Well, no, that's a fine question. So keep in mind that Wi-Fi and most Internet of Things, most devices that are wireless communicating, are using 2.4 gigahertz. Now, there are exceptions to that, but the thing about 2.4 gigahertz is that pretty much in every country in the world, 2.4 gigahertz is an unregulated frequency band, which is to say that almost any device is allowed to use that frequency without getting, where the approval process is not super onerous and super involved. And you don't have to have, the person that's using the device doesn't have to have a license to operate there. Anyone can turn on a 2.4 gigahertz piece of equipment. Everyone has it on their phones, so on and so forth. What we're talking about here with the wireless systems with the 8 series, all of that wireless operates in completely different frequencies, well away from 2.4 gigahertz. So No wireless system guarantees lack of interference or lack of dropouts, but the new technologies, and if you're really interested in hearing a little bit more about it, 2 or 3 weeks ago on our main channel, we did a video on the Sound Devices A20 Mini, and we talked about how that provides a lot more flexibility and a lot more frequency range so that you are more likely to be able to have a nice clean frequency with which to work. So no, there's never a guarantee with anything, but when you start moving up to the systems that are typically used with the Sound Devices 8 series, you're using wireless. It's operating in a different frequency altogether from Wi-Fi and smartphones. Pete, thanks so much for the super chat. Appreciate that. Thanks for coming by today. Steve, are there features on the 8 series and MixPre for protecting hearing from sudden high SPL transients? I mean, there are limiters, and you should always be responsible about how you set your headphone volume. There are limiters, there's a compressor. If you need those for whatever reason, for whatever you're recording, a lot of, like my friend Watson Wu, who does a lot of sound effects recording, he will typically run the sounds, like a lot of even the firearms and stuff like that, he'll run them so that they intentionally hit up against the limiters, but he's always watching his headphone volume. So I don't know if there's any specific features for managing your headphone volume other than your headphone volume knob, but these are professional tools, and I think all professionals should be in a situation where they can manage that nicely. So anyway, I'm getting the timeout signal here. So all right, we covered a lot. We have a lot more to cover, obviously. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you have an opportunity to get out and work on some of your sound projects. And until then, get out there and make some great sound. We'll talk to you next week. Take care, everybody.